The mail-order bride never came. The cowboy found her dying and refused to walk away. The cowboy had lived most of his life on this wide, open land. His ranch stretched over miles of rolling hills, dotted with tall grasses and scattered oak trees. The wind always seemed to carry a whisper, rustling through the fields and sometimes howling at night, reminding him how alone he really was. He had built the ranch with his own hands, caring for the animals, fixing fences, and tending the land. But no matter how busy he kept himself, a quiet loneliness lingered in the corners of his heart. Years ago, he had tried to fill that emptiness. He had dated, courted, and even considered marriage once, but circumstances and heartbreak had left him alone again. He had grown used to the silence of the prairie, the empty meals, and the nights when only the stars watched over him. Still, he longed for someone to share his life, someone who could understand the quiet rhythm of the land, the hard work, and the simple joys of ranch life. It was during one of those long, lonely evenings that he decided to try something he had thought about for a while. He had read stories and heard accounts of men who had found partners through letters and introductions from faraway places. Maybe it was old-fashioned or unusual, but he felt it was worth a chance. The idea of a mail-order bride seemed strange, yet it offered hope, a possibility of companionship with someone who wanted a simple life, someone who could share the hardships and joys of his world. He carefully wrote to a woman he had never met. He explained his life, his work, and what he hoped for in a partner. He promised honesty, hard work, and kindness. In return, he hoped for sincerity and trust. Weeks passed, and he waited anxiously, checking the mailbox every day. Each letter brought a flicker of hope, but also a lingering doubt. There was no reply, and the days turned into weeks. The ranch was quiet. The horses grazed lazily in the pasture, the cows moved slowly across the field, and the sun rose and set over the horizon in the same steady rhythm it always had. Yet, for the cowboy, each quiet day felt heavier than the last. He imagined the woman reading his letters, wondering if she would ever respond. He thought about the journey she would have to make, traveling alone across towns and train stations to reach this lonely place. Every night he stared at the stars, imagining her somewhere far away, hoping she was safe, even as worry gnawed at him. Then one morning he noticed something unusual. As he was riding along the northern edge of his property, checking the fences and water troughs, he saw a faint trail leading into the woods near the old cabin at the far end of his land. It was unusual because no one had been near that cabin for years, and it had long been abandoned. The trail looked recent, as if someone had walked quickly through the grass, leaving broken twigs and footprints pressed into the earth. A chill ran through him. He wasn't sure why, but something felt wrong. The mail-order bride was supposed to arrive days ago. The letters he had sent had gone unanswered. Could this trail have something to do with her? The thought made his heart race. He urged his horse forward slowly, keeping his eyes on the trail. Each step toward the cabin made him more anxious, yet he couldn't turn back. As he approached, he heard a sound that made him stop in his tracks. It was faint but unmistakable, a cough, weak and ragged, coming from inside the cabin. The cowboy's heart pounded. He dismounted and tied his horse to a nearby tree, moving carefully toward the door. The cabin was old, wooden planks weathered by years of wind and rain, the roof sagging in places. The door creaked as he pushed it open, and the smell of dust, cold air, and something faintly sweet met his senses. There, in the dim light, he saw her. The woman was sitting on the floor, leaning against the wall. Her clothes were dirty and torn, her face pale, and her breathing shallow. She looked fragile, almost as if a strong gust of wind could blow her away. For a moment, she did not recognize him. Her eyes were half closed, and a faint cough shook her small frame. The sight hit him like a blow. He had expected disappointment, maybe hesitation, but not this. He had not expected her to be in such danger. Without a second thought, he knelt beside her. "Hey," he said softly, keeping his voice calm. "You're going to be okay. I won't leave you." His words were simple, but they carried determination. He gently lifted her into his arms, careful not to hurt her further. Her body felt weak and fragile, but he did not hesitate. The thought of leaving her there was impossible. She was alive, and he could not ignore that. The journey back to the ranch was slow. His horse moved steadily, and he carried her as best as he could, talking to her in low, soothing tones. He told her not to worry, that she was safe now, and that she didn't need to fear. Each word was meant to reassure, to show her that she was not alone. The wind whipped around them, cold and biting, but he focused only on her, willing her to stay conscious, willing her to survive. By the time they reached the ranch, the sun had begun to dip behind the hills, painting the sky with streaks of orange and pink. He gently laid her on a blanket near the fireplace, wrapping her in warmth. He fetched water, cleaned her wounds, and tried to make her comfortable. Every small movement, every action was driven by a single thought: she would not be left behind. As night fell, he stayed by her side. The wind howled outside, rattling the windows, but inside there was a small sense of safety. He watched her chest rise and fall with each shallow breath, feeling a mix of worry and hope. He had found her, and he would do everything he could to keep her alive. He had waited for a companion for so long, but this was more than waiting now. This was a test of courage, patience, and heart. Hours passed, and the woman slowly opened her eyes. At first there was confusion, fear in her gaze. She tried to speak, but her voice was barely a whisper. The cowboy leaned closer, listening carefully, nodding gently. He did not press her for answers. He only offered reassurance through presence, patience, and gentle care. In that quiet night, a bond began to form. Not yet love, not yet trust, but the fragile beginning of connection. The cowboy had never imagined that finding the woman he had written to would involve such fear, urgency, and responsibility. Yet he felt no hesitation. Leaving her was impossible. He had chosen to wait for a companion in life, and now fate had put her in front of him in the most desperate moment. As the night deepened, he thought about the days ahead. He would need to care for her, nurse her back to health, and help her feel safe in a world that had seemed cruel and unforgiving. But he did not think about how hard it would be. He only thought about the promise he made in his heart. He would not walk away. Not now, not ever. Outside, the wind continued to sweep across the prairie. The stars twinkled above, indifferent yet eternal. The ranch was quiet, but inside, a silent battle of survival and hope had begun. The cowboy and the woman were two strangers thrown together by chance and misfortune, yet bound by the fragile thread of life. He watched over her as she slept, the firelight flickering across her face, and he knew that the coming days would test them both. But for now, she was alive, and he had refused to turn away. It was not the arrival he had expected when he ordered a bride. It was not the simple companionship he had imagined in his letters. It was more complicated, more urgent, more real. And he realized something deep inside. The heart does not follow plans or letters. It responds to need, to presence, to the quiet insistence of caring for someone when they are at their lowest. And so, under the quiet stars and the gentle warmth of the fire, the cowboy began his journey, not just as a man waiting for a companion, but as a protector, a witness, and perhaps, in time, someone who would find in this fragile woman a kindred spirit. The night was long, and the path ahead was uncertain, but one thing was clear: he would not leave her behind, no matter what challenges awaited them. The next morning, the cowboy awoke before sunrise, as he always did. The ranch was quiet, except for the soft lowing of the cows and the occasional clatter of horses in the barn. But his mind was not on the routine work he usually performed. His thoughts were with her, the woman he had found the night before, lying fragile and weak on the blanket by the fireplace. He rose quietly, careful not to disturb her rest. He knew how important it was for her to regain strength and how little energy she had. She had survived days of exposure, illness, and fear, and now every small movement mattered. The cowboy fetched water and warm cloths from the kitchen and returned to the living area. He gently cleaned her face and hands, noticing every detail: the pallor of her skin, the slight tremor in her fingers, and the faint signs of dehydration. She stirred slightly, her eyes fluttering open. There was fear in her gaze, confusion as to where she was and who this man was. He smiled softly, trying to offer reassurance without words. "You're safe here," he whispered. "I won't let anything happen to you." She tried to speak, but her voice barely emerged, a whisper of exhaustion and disbelief. The cowboy understood. Words were not always necessary. Sometimes actions spoke louder than promises, and he intended to show her through patience, care, and quiet attention that she was not alone anymore. He stayed by her side throughout the morning, helping her sip water, eating small pieces of bread, and resting. Each hour brought a tiny improvement, a faint return of color to her cheeks, a stronger inhale, a more confident movement. By mid-morning, the sun had risen fully, spilling light across the room. The cowboy decided it was time to bring her to a safer, warmer part of the ranch. He gently lifted her again, careful not to strain her weakened body. She leaned into him without words, trusting him just enough to let him carry her. The journey to the ranch house was slow, each step taken with care. The horses and livestock watched quietly as the cowboy carried her through the yard, past the barns and fields. Inside the main house, he laid her on a bed by the window where the sun could warm her. Blankets were layered beneath her, and a soft quilt covered her shivering form. He made a small pot of herbal tea and brought it to her. "Sip this slowly," he instructed. She took tiny sips, her eyes watching him closely, unsure if she should trust this stranger who had become her only hope. The days that followed were filled with routine and quiet care. The cowboy attended to the animals and the ranch chores, but his eyes always drifted back to her. He checked on her constantly, adjusting blankets, preparing meals, and encouraging her to take small steps or eat a little more. Each success, no matter how minor, was a victory. A few sips of water, a short walk across the room, a smile that reached her eyes. She began to speak more, though cautiously. Her voice was soft and hesitant at first, but with each passing day, she shared more about herself. She told him of the long journey she had tried to make, the illness that struck her before she could reach the ranch, and the fear that had overwhelmed her. She spoke of the loneliness she had felt in the towns she passed through, the uncertainty of trusting strangers, and the hope that had kept her moving forward despite every obstacle. The cowboy listened without judgment. He shared little about himself, not because he did not want to, but because he wanted her to feel safe without feeling pressured. Yet slowly he shared pieces of his life, how he came to this land, the losses he had endured, and the quiet routine of working the ranch day after day. In these moments, the walls around her heart began to soften. She realized that he, too, knew loss and hardship, and that perhaps, just perhaps, he could understand her pain. There were moments of fear and doubt. Some mornings she would wake trembling, her mind replaying the horrors she had endured. She would glance around the room, looking for signs of danger, and the cowboy would calm her with quiet reassurance. "You're safe now, nothing will hurt you here," he would say, and though her eyes still held fear, she learned to trust that his words were true. The physical healing was slow but steady. He brought in fresh food, warmed water, and even herbs to help her recover. He encouraged her to sit by the window, watch the horses, and breathe in the fresh air. The simple tasks, walking short distances, stretching her arms, and helping with small chores, became milestones. Each time she managed something new, the cowboy offered a quiet nod of approval, a gentle smile, or a few encouraging words. Evenings were the hardest. The shadows of the past seemed strongest when the world was quiet. She would sometimes cry softly, alone, ashamed of her fear and weakness. The cowboy never forced her to speak. Instead, he sat near her, sometimes reading aloud from old books, sometimes whistling softly, letting the rhythm of his presence provide comfort. She learned that even silence could carry trust, that companionship was not always about conversation, but about being there when it mattered most. One afternoon, a sudden storm swept across the plains. The wind howled, rain fell in sheets, and the trees bent under the force of the gusts. The cabin rattled, and the sound of thunder shook the walls. The woman froze in fear, clinging to her blanket. The cowboy quickly gathered her in his arms again, speaking softly, "I've got you. You're safe with me, just hold on." He carried her to a more secure part of the house, away from the windows, and held her close until the storm passed. It was during these moments of crisis that their bond grew strongest. She realized that he was not just a caretaker, but someone who would go to any length to protect her. He was steady, reliable, and unafraid. And slowly she began to trust not only his actions, but also his character. The vulnerability she had carried for so long, the fear that had kept her isolated, began to melt away in the warmth of his steadfast care. By the end of the second week, she was stronger, able to walk without support, eat proper meals, and even help with small tasks around the ranch. The cowboy encouraged her to try chores slowly, feeding chickens, gathering eggs, helping with the garden. Each activity was a step toward independence, yet he remained nearby, ready to assist. She began to feel a sense of pride and accomplishment, a feeling she had not experienced in months, perhaps years. Trust continued to grow in small ways. She would share stories of her childhood, her hopes for the future, and the fears that had haunted her during the journey. He listened, sometimes responding with gentle advice, sometimes simply acknowledging her words with a nod or quiet smile. She learned to laugh again, softly at first, then more freely, as the tension of fear and illness lifted. Yet there were still moments of hesitation. She feared becoming attached, worried that the kindness she received might be fleeting. She had endured so much disappointment that trusting another person seemed risky. But the cowboy never pushed. He understood that patience and consistency were stronger than promises or words. By showing her day after day that he would not abandon her, he slowly broke down the walls around her heart. One evening, as the sun set in a blaze of orange and pink across the prairie, she stood by the window, watching the horizon. The cowboy approached quietly, standing beside her without touching, simply sharing the view. "The land looks different at sunset, doesn't it?" he said. She nodded, her eyes reflecting the warm colors of the sky. For the first time, she spoke without hesitation, sharing a thought or observation purely because she wanted to, not because she felt obliged. That small exchange marked a turning point. She began to see him not just as a stranger who had saved her life, but as someone she could rely on, someone whose presence made the harsh world around her feel a little gentler. She realized that survival was not just about recovering from illness, but about having someone to trust, someone who believed in her even when she could not believe in herself. As the weeks continued, the cowboy's care became routine but also intimate in its simplicity. He knew when she needed quiet, when she needed encouragement, and when she needed to be left alone. She began to anticipate his small gestures, placing a warm cloth on her forehead, offering tea, or simply standing nearby when she needed comfort. In return, she offered gratitude, trust, and the beginnings of friendship. The journey ahead was far from over. There would be challenges, moments of doubt, and days when her strength faltered, but the foundation had been laid. She had survived the night she almost did not, and the cowboy had refused to turn away. In those weeks of recovery, they had discovered something that neither expected, that even in the harshest, loneliest places, human kindness could create hope, and hope could lead to a bond strong enough to overcome fear and despair. By the end of part 2, she could stand on her own, move through the ranch with cautious confidence, and face the outside world with a renewed sense of possibility. The cowboy had not only saved her life, but had also offered her a chance to see that trust, patience, and care could heal wounds far deeper than illness. And while they had not yet spoken of love, a quiet connection had formed, one built on shared hardship, loyalty, and the unspoken promise that neither would walk away from the other. The story was no longer about a mail-order bride who never arrived. It was about survival, trust, and the power of steadfast care. And as she looked out at the open fields, feeling the strength returning to her body, she realized that the cowboy was not just a protector. He was a presence she could rely on, a man whose refusal to walk away had changed the course of her life forever. By the time the 3rd week had passed, the woman had regained much of her strength. She could walk across the ranch on her own, her steps cautious at first but gradually becoming more confident. The sun warmed her face as she moved among the animals, and the gentle rustle of the grass beneath her boots reminded her that life could be steady and simple if she allowed herself to feel it. The cowboy watched her quietly, never interfering unless she asked for help, letting her discover her strength on her own while remaining close enough to step in if danger or difficulty arose. The daily routine they had established began to feel natural. Morning chores were followed by small tasks around the house, cooking simple meals, gathering eggs from the chickens, or helping in the garden. At first, she had been hesitant to participate, fearing she might slow things down or make a mistake. But the cowboy encouraged her gently, always emphasizing her progress rather than pointing out errors. "You're doing fine," he would say. "Every day you get stronger." His words were simple, yet they carried the weight of reassurance and trust. Gradually, they began to share more than just work. Evenings were no longer filled only with quiet observation or routine care. Sometimes the cowboy would tell stories of his childhood, of the family he had lost, and of the struggles that had brought him to the ranch. She listened attentively, fascinated by the life he had built and the quiet strength he carried within him. In turn, she began to share pieces of her own story, the towns she had traveled through, the hardships she had endured, and the hope that had kept her moving forward despite fear and sickness. It was not always easy. There were moments when her past would return with a sharp edge. A sudden memory of illness, abandonment, or mistrust would make her pause or retreat. On such days, she would sit quietly, sometimes staring out at the horizon, lost in thought. The cowboy never pressed her. He understood that trust could not be rushed, and that patience was more powerful than any promise. He would simply sit nearby, sometimes reading aloud from a book, sometimes whistling a soft tune, and always remaining a calm and steady presence. One afternoon, as she helped him gather firewood, she slipped and nearly fell. The cowboy caught her quickly, holding her steady against his chest. She trembled, not from the fall, but from the sudden fear that had gripped her. "It's okay," he whispered. "You're safe with me. I won't let anything happen to you." In that moment, a bond deepened between them, not through words, but through actions. She realized that his care was unwavering, that he would not abandon her even in moments of fear or weakness. As the days turned into weeks, their conversations grew more personal. They spoke of hopes for the future, dreams of building a home together, of planting more gardens, of taking care of the land in ways that would honor it for years to come. She began to laugh more easily, a soft and genuine sound that had been absent for far too long. She began to trust not only the cowboy's actions, but also his intentions, believing that his steadfastness was real and not fleeting. Yet, trust was not the only challenge. She carried fear and vulnerability deep within her. She feared that if she allowed herself to feel too much, she might be hurt again. She worried that life had already been too cruel, that she did not deserve the comfort and care she was now receiving. On such nights, she would lie awake, staring at the ceiling, questioning whether she could ever fully open her heart. The cowboy, sensing her unease, would often sit silently nearby, his presence a steady reassurance that she was not alone. He never forced conversation, knowing that silence could be as comforting as words. Their bond was tested one evening when a sudden storm swept across the prairie. Rain poured from the sky in sheets, wind tore at the trees, and the cabin walls shook with the force of the tempest. The woman panicked, fear flashing across her face. The cowboy acted quickly, gathering her into his arms and moving her to a safer part of the house. "I've got you," he said softly. "You're safe with me." "Hold on." He held her close as the storm raged outside, whispering words of reassurance, not just to calm her, but also to remind himself of the promise he had made. He would not walk away. The storm passed, leaving the world outside drenched but calm. She clung to him briefly, not out of need alone, but because she now trusted that he would remain by her side no matter what. That night, as she lay in bed, she felt a quiet sense of gratitude for the cowboy who had carried her through fear, illness, and uncertainty. She realized that survival was not only about healing physically, but also about finding someone who would not abandon her when she was most vulnerable. As the weeks continued, the cowboy began to notice small changes in her demeanor. She moved more confidently around the ranch, she smiled more freely, and she laughed without reservation. She helped with the animals and chores, but more importantly, she began to take pride in her independence and strength. Yet she always remembered the nights when she had been weak, and she never took his steadfast care for granted. Each act of kindness, each quiet reassurance, reinforced the trust that had begun to form between them. One day, while mending a fence together, she paused and looked at him thoughtfully. I don't know what I would have done without you," she admitted quietly. He glanced at her, catching the subtle vulnerability in her eyes. "You don't have to thank me," he replied. "I would do the same again. You're not alone anymore." Those words, simple yet sincere, resonated deeply within her. She realized that she had begun to see him not just as a protector, but as someone who genuinely cared for her well-being and happiness. Their connection deepened further through shared routines and quiet moments. They would sit on the porch in the evenings, watching the sunset paint the sky in warm shades of orange and pink. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they sat in comfortable silence, each presence reinforcing the bond between them. She began to understand that trust and affection were built over time, through consistent care, patience, and understanding, rather than through grand gestures or promises. Despite these positive changes, there were still challenges. Some mornings, she would wake feeling vulnerable, haunted by memories of the hardships she had endured. She would hesitate, unsure if she could truly belong in this new world with this man who had become her anchor. The cowboy, patient as always, would stay by her side, offering quiet comfort. He never pushed her, never demanded explanations. His presence alone was enough to provide reassurance and stability. A turning point came one morning when a small mishap occurred with one of the animals. A calf had wandered too close to a ditch, and the woman instinctively tried to help. She stumbled, and the cowboy was there in an instant, steadying her and guiding the calf to safety. She realized in that moment that she could face challenges not just because she was strong, but because someone reliable and caring was there to support her when needed. This realization marked a shift in her confidence and self-assurance. By the end of the third week, the bond between them had grown strong and undeniable. She no longer feared being alone, nor did she hesitate to rely on him when necessary. He had shown her that consistency, patience, and unwavering care could heal wounds that seemed insurmountable. She began to consider the possibility of a life that was not defined by fear, sickness, or abandonment, but by trust, hope, and shared experience. They had not yet spoken of love, and there was no rush for words. Their relationship was rooted in respect, care, and mutual reliance. Yet, an unspoken connection lingered between them, a quiet understanding that went beyond simple companionship. It was in the way he always noticed her needs before she spoke, the way she instinctively turned to him in moments of fear, and the way both had begun to find comfort in each other's presence. Even as trust grew, she knew there were still fears to face. She worried about the future, about her ability to adapt fully to life on the ranch, and about whether she could truly belong. But the cowboy's steady presence offered a constant reminder that she was not alone. Each day, through simple acts of care, shared routines, and quiet conversations, she learned to face her fears and embrace the possibility of a new life. By the end of part 3, she had grown stronger physically, emotionally, and mentally. The cowboy had proven that loyalty, patience, and steadfast care could create a bond far deeper than words alone. The stage was now set for the final phase of their story, one where trust transforms into mutual respect, hope blossoms into love, and a fragile connection becomes the foundation for a shared life. By the time the fourth week had arrived, the woman had become almost unrecognizable from the fragile, trembling figure the cowboy had found in that abandoned cabin. Her steps were confident, her hands steady as she worked alongside him, and her laughter now filled the ranch in a way it never had before. The warmth of the sun seemed to mirror the new life that had begun to take root in her heart. She moved with purpose, caring for the animals, helping with chores, and even organizing small spaces around the house. Each action reminded her that she was no longer a victim of circumstance, but a partner in this life that had slowly become hers. The cowboy watched her from a distance at first, marveling at how far she had come. It was not only her physical recovery that amazed him, but also the way she had begun to trust herself again. Her fear of being abandoned had softened, replaced by cautious hope. He had witnessed the transformation not as a distant observer, but as someone who had held her through storms, both literal and emotional, someone who had refused to walk away even when survival seemed uncertain. They had begun to establish routines that blended work and shared moments of quiet companionship. Mornings were spent tending the animals and checking fences, afternoons in the fields or garden, and evenings on the porch watching the sun set over the horizon. Sometimes they spoke, sometimes they sat silently, feeling a sense of comfort simply in each other's presence. There was no rush to define their relationship, no pressure to speak of love before it was ready. They had learned that trust and care were the foundation of all meaningful connections, and that patience could create a bond stronger than words alone. One day, as she helped him mend a section of fence damaged by a recent storm, she paused and looked at him with a thoughtful expression. "I never thought I could feel safe like this," she said softly. The cowboy continued his work, glancing at her briefly with a reassuring smile. "You're safe," he replied simply, "and you always will be. I'm not going anywhere." Her eyes glistened with a mixture of gratitude and relief. Those words, spoken with unwavering sincerity, carried more weight than any grand declaration could have. She realized that safety and trust were not just about protection from the outside world. They were about knowing someone would be there for her, no matter what. The weeks brought small joys that built into something larger. They would watch the horses grazing in the distance, talk quietly about dreams for the future, and share meals they had prepared together. She had started learning about the ranch, about the animals, and about the land that had been the cowboy's life for so long. Each day she felt more at home, more capable, and more connected, not only to the ranch but to the man who had given her the chance to rebuild her life. Yet, the past still lingered in quiet corners of her mind. She would sometimes wake in the middle of the night, startled by dreams of abandonment or illness. The cowboy, always attentive, would quietly reassure her with a gentle touch on her shoulder or a calm presence beside her. He never forced conversation or explanations. Instead, he let her know through his actions that she was not alone, that she could face her fears because he would remain steadfast, a constant support. A turning point came one afternoon when they encountered a challenge that required teamwork and trust. A calf had wandered into a narrow ravine, unable to climb out, and was in danger. Without hesitation, the cowboy approached, assessing the situation calmly. The woman, now strong enough to help, offered to assist. Together, they worked carefully, guiding the calf to safety. It was a moment that symbolized everything they had been building together: cooperation, trust, patience, and mutual reliance. The woman realized that she no longer feared challenges because she had someone beside her who shared the burden, who would face obstacles with her rather than for her. As they stood together afterward, catching their breath and watching the calf rejoin the herd, she felt a surge of emotion. She looked at the cowboy, and for the first time she allowed herself to feel fully the depth of gratitude and trust that had grown between them. She realized that the man who had once been a stranger was now someone she could depend on completely, someone who had refused to walk away when it mattered most. Their connection continued to deepen through small gestures and shared routines. He would teach her to ride the horses confidently, show her how to mend fences properly, and include her in decisions about the ranch. She, in turn, would prepare meals, help organize supplies, and care for the animals with increasing skill. Each action reinforced the bond between them, turning trust into a partnership that was both practical and emotional. Evenings became moments of reflection and quiet joy. They would sit together on the porch, watching the sun sink below the horizon, painting the sky in shades of orange and pink. Sometimes they would speak of the past, of lessons learned and hardships endured. Other times they would simply sit in silence, appreciating the presence of the other, feeling the rhythm of life that they had built together. These moments, though simple, carried profound meaning. They were not just surviving, they were living, and they were doing it together. One evening, as the stars emerged in the clear night sky, she spoke softly. "I never thought I could trust someone like this," she admitted. The cowboy looked at her, his eyes calm and steady. "Trust isn't something you give all at once," he said. "It grows. And you've earned it every step of the way." She smiled, a smile full of relief, gratitude, and a quiet recognition that she had found something rare and precious in this man, a steadfast heart that would not abandon her. Days turned into weeks and the seasons began to shift. The ranch flourished, and so did their connection. She had learned not only to survive, but to thrive. The cowboy had helped her see that life, though unpredictable, could also be beautiful when shared with someone who cared deeply. She began to take pride in her new life, in her ability to contribute, and in the trust that had grown between them. As her confidence grew, so did the warmth of their companionship. They began to share dreams for the future, plans for the ranch, hopes for the land, and visions of a life together. These conversations were gentle, filled with cautious optimism, yet they reflected the profound bond that had formed through weeks of care, trust, and shared experience. The woman realized that she had not just survived. She had found a life worth embracing, guided by the quiet strength of the cowboy who had refused to turn away. The final moments of transformation came one sunny afternoon. The woman had spent the morning helping with chores and tending the animals, and she paused to rest under the shade of a large oak tree. The cowboy approached, carrying a basket of fresh vegetables from the garden. They shared a simple lunch, laughing and talking about small details of daily life. There was no grand gesture, no dramatic confession, just two people, side by side, comfortable and secure in each other's presence. It was in these quiet, ordinary moments that the true depth of their bond became clear. She realized that love was not always about passion or drama. It could be found in steadfast care, shared responsibility, and the willingness to remain when it mattered most. The cowboy had shown her that by refusing to walk away, by offering patience and support, he had given her the chance to heal, grow, and trust again. By the end of the month, she was fully recovered, not only physically but emotionally and mentally. She could move confidently across the ranch, care for the animals, and engage fully in the rhythms of daily life. More importantly, she had learned to trust in herself and in the man who had stood by her through every challenge. Their relationship had evolved from caretaker and patient into partners, connected by shared experiences, mutual respect, and a deep understanding of one another's hearts. The story that had begun with fear, illness, and uncertainty ended with hope, trust, and renewal. She no longer saw herself as a fragile traveler who had almost been lost. She was a capable, strong, and confident woman who had found not only safety, but companionship and understanding. The cowboy, in turn, had found in her a partner who appreciated his care, matched his resilience, and shared his vision for life on the ranch. As the sun set on the prairie, casting long shadows across the fields, they stood together, watching the horses graze peacefully. The wind carried a gentle warmth, and the sky glowed in shades of orange, pink, and gold. She looked at him, a full, unguarded smile on her face, and for the first time in months she felt truly at home. The cowboy met her gaze, and in that silent exchange, words were unnecessary. Their journey had been long and difficult, but it had brought them to a place of connection, trust, and hope. In that quiet, ordinary moment, the story reached its resolution. The mail-order bride, who had never arrived in the expected way, had found her life not through letters or plans, but through the unwavering presence of someone who refused to walk away. Together they had transformed fear into confidence, weakness into strength, and uncertainty into trust. The ranch, once a place of solitude and hard work, had become a home filled with life, companionship, and the promise of a shared future. As night fell and stars began to twinkle above, the woman and the cowboy remained together, side by side. They had faced storms, fear, and uncertainty, and they had emerged stronger, bound not by circumstance alone, but by choice, care, and the quiet power of refusing to abandon someone in need. And in that refusal, they had found a life worth living together.